I'm going to just start by maybe asking some very kind of naive questions, or seemingly naive questions, that I think will underline what I talk about today and what I will talk about next week, more specifically. So these questions include the question of what constitutes a subject or the subject, what are objects, and what is the relation between the two, if any, which is what Sean just summarized. Can philosophy generally really truly go beyond the subject? Or can we truly decenter the subject, as it is sometimes claimed? How and in what way? Why is this desirable? So if we can go beyond the subject, if this was maybe somehow philosophically, let's say, feasible or doable, then the question is why? Why is it something that philosophy needs to be doing or ought to do? And of course, finally, what is the relation between idealism and realism, or an idealist philosophy and a materialist one? What do we mean by materialism? What do we mean by idealism? So essentially what I want to say today is basically before philosophy, because we're speaking about theory or philosophical theory at this point, before philosophy can go about decentering or going beyond or outside of the subject, it needs to first understand what subjectivity is. It needs to first get clear on what exactly constitutes the nature of the subject. How can we get beyond the subject if we don't know what the subject is, if we don't know where the subject ends and that which is non-subjective or that which is not the subject begins? We need to know its determinations, its qualities, its attributes, the conditions. Essentially, we need a concept of the subject in order to decenter, if you see what I mean. This is what all of these orientations that maintain that we have to get beyond the subject presuppose. Or at least it seems to me that this is what they presuppose. Maybe they claim that they don't need to define the subject. That's fine. So what I will be presenting here today is simply a polite reminder of the complexities of subjectivity and the difficulties in our attempt and with our attempt to understand the nature of the subject itself. I believe that Hegel's dialectical philosophy, and with it, as we will examine more closely next time, Marx's dialectical materialism, is perhaps still the unsurpassed account of subjectivity and its relation to materialism. So, if what I will say today sounds somewhat polemical against certain forms of contemporary materialisms, then rest assured that is because it is meant to be polemical. However, just because it might be a bit polemical does not mean that it is done in an antagonistic or combative manner. I invite different viewpoints and objections, and I hope we can have a productive discussion about all of this. So I'm going to begin with just a kind of brief cursory overview of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Some of you may have read it, some of you may have not read it. That's fine. I'm not going to be summarizing the entire thing. That would be impossible. I'm just focusing on about the sort of 15, 20 pages that make up the introduction to the phenomenology, because I think it is there where Hegel invites us to think about the complexities between the relation between a subject and an object in some detail. So I'm going to point and highlight a few things that I think are relevant here. So in the opening section, in the opening paragraph of this introduction, Hegel says something interesting. He says, before philosophy can seize and grasp the truth, it has to necessarily understand the nature of cognition, or the nature of consciousness, which he says can be thought of as an instrument by which the truth, in this case what he calls the absolute, is seized. Or rather, cognition is that which allows philosophy to get a sight of the absolute, as he says. So philosophy, points out Hegel, justifies its use of cognition or its understanding of cognition because there may be different forms of cognition that may not lead to the truth. He says there may be different forms of consciousness that are better suited to do the job, that are better suited to seize and grasp the absolute truth. And so for this reason, philosophy needs to be careful. It needs to be able to determine which forms of cognition are true or adequately suited for the absolute and which forms of cognition are not. And philosophy needs to do this in order to avoid falling into error. Because the point, of course, is to understand that which is absolutely true. And by absolute in this context, at least this is the way I think of it, Hegel means that which is not relative. So absolute truth is a sort of truth that is not relative to any other form of truth. So it is not opinion, it is not subjective experience and so on. It is that which is self-sufficient and self-relating. And so it is absolutely true by virtue of not being relative to anything else. So philosophy can seize this truth. It needs to, he says, not fall into error. He warns that philosophy may end up, quote, grasping clouds of error rather than the heaven of truth. And so to get at the heaven of truth, we have to think about cognition. We have to understand what cognition is. Because after all, philosophy's business is to know and comprehend the absolute. So it's not enough to just know conceptually what the absolute is. We have to think the absolute. We have to know the absolute. We have to have knowledge of it. So there's an epistemological claim at work here as well as a conceptual one. Okay, so cognition. Well, Hegel says, look, we can either think about cognition as an instrument or as a medium. If it's conceived of as an instrument, then it's a tool. It's something we use to grasp the absolute. Like how we're all using computers to be in this Zoom call at the moment, right? So there's an instrumental function to cognition. But there's a problem with this way of thinking about cognition, as he says, because an instrument necessarily affects and changes the thing it is meant to grasp. If you want a very basic example, if you use a stick to poke at a stone or something, or poke at some dirt out in the forest, the stick is the tool, of course, but the dirt or the rock or whatever it is that you're poking at alters, changes. You know, you poke at the rock with the stick, the rock moves. So you end up changing that with which you're using the instrument to seize. And this is a problem, right? Because if the absolute truth is meant to be non-relative, we don't want to alter it in any way. We don't want to, in a sense, subvert its absolute status by injecting it with something that is somehow not within it as an absolute, if you see what I mean. So this instrument, so thinking about cognition as an instrument is a bit faulty for Hegel. This doesn't really work. All right, he says, what about the medium? If we conceive of cognition as a medium, as a passive medium, rather than an active instrument, as something that just kind of receives the absolute and reveals the absolute to the subject, then what about that option? Well, we don't really necessarily grasp the absolute as the absolute is in itself, so to speak, but we only kind of seize the absolute as it passes through the medium. So a very simple example, and Hegel uses this metaphor, if you use a prism to refract sunlight, the thing you want to seize are the rays of sunlight, not so much what you get out of the prism, if you see what I mean. So cognition as a medium falls apart as well, even though it's passive and not active like the instrument. So it seems, right, and Hegel points this out, that whether we think of cognition as an instrument, as an active instrument, or as a passive medium, we fall into the same trap. Namely, we end up obscuring and changing the absolute truth as opposed to properly seizing it or grasping it. And if we obscure or change that which is absolute, it ceases to be truth and it ceases to be absolute. So that doesn't work. And so he goes on to point out, and if you're following along in the readings, or if you've done the readings, this is section 74 and 75 in the Phenomenology. Hegel says that all this business about understanding cognition and having a good notion of the cognition in order to not fall into error is, he says, philosophy's fear of making a mistake, of making an error. But this fear of making an error, this mistrust of error, he says, that philosophy has, or has assumed in this case, is itself an error, is itself a problem. Because it presupposes a lot of things, right? And what we've just laid out, or what Hegel has just summarized in the first two paragraphs, is that we're working with a framework wherein the absolute is on one side and cognition, or the subject, is on the other side. And so the subject is somehow outside the absolute and is trying to get inside the absolute, or is trying to seize the absolute. So this whole framework, he says, is a big presupposition, and philosophy falls into error. So he also points out that there are even more presuppositions at work here. In paragraph 76, he says, all this talk about cognition or truth, the subject, the object, and so on, these are all concepts that are presupposed by philosophy. And they're presupposed because we assume that their meanings are readily intelligible, that they're well known. Everyone knows what an object is. Everybody knows what a subject is. So philosophy doesn't have to justify its use of these terms at all. And of course, this is a problem for Hegel, because when philosophy makes an assumption, what it does is it presupposes certain things, it assumes certain things that it doesn't seek to demonstrate or prove or justify. And so in this case, it ends up running into contradictions and problems. So we may think, well, what is the way in which we can grasp the absolute? If thinking about cognition as a medium and instrument doesn't work out for Hegel, what do we do? Well, he says, and this is in paragraph 78, we have to just kind of follow consciousness naturally, he says, right? And it is at this point that he uses the famous path of despair metaphor to describe the exposition of what he calls natural consciousness as it traverses the odyssey towards absolute truth. Philosophy just has to kind of sit back and observe natural consciousness as natural consciousness experiences things in the world. Now, I want to highlight something here, because although we may have all heard about the path of despair or the path of doubt and so on in Hegel, which is at this point very famous, Hegel calls this path, quote, the self-consummating skepticism. And I want to highlight this for you because I think if we think about dialectics and if we think about dialectical philosophy as a radical form of skepticism, more radical than empirical skepticism, then this will help us, this will remind us that we ought not to assume or presuppose the meaning of any concept, including the subject and the object, right? We have to be skeptical about these things until we conceptually determine them or define them. So the path of despair, he calls this self-consummating skepticism. And like I just said, it's a radical form of skepticism that does not make any assumptions about cognition, truth, or the nature of subjectivity or objectivity. So what about the relation between the subject and the object? Because if we are trying to have a knowledge of the absolute, we're dealing with a consciousness of the absolute, right? We're dealing with a cognition of the absolute. And insofar as we're dealing with a cognition and a consciousness, Hegel says there's a difference at work. There's consciousness, and there's that which consciousness seeks to apprehend and comprehend. So in other words, there is a knowing subject, if we can think about it this way, and the object that the subject wants to understand. So there's something different from and distinguished by and from consciousness that is in some sense external to consciousness on one level, yet not unrelated or totally, but this externality isn't total in a certain respect. And Hegel explains why. So he says the object of knowing, or the object of consciousness, is that which consciousness forms a cognition of and has a knowledge about, on the one hand. And on the other hand, this object is at the same time, in a sense, external to consciousness. Consciousness is perceiving it, right? And is forming thoughts about it. So here he's being really careful, and this is in paragraph 84, if you're wondering. Because what Hegel is pointing out here is that even though we may assume that there's a subject here and an object outside of us or external to us, this external object is still immanent to the subject on one level. And that is, as he says, as a form of cognition, right? So as an example, if you see an apple on the table, the apple is not inside of you. You haven't eaten the apple. You haven't consumed it. It's sitting on a table, right? So on the one hand, it is external to us. It is very much outside of us. It is on the table. But at the same time, we know that this is an apple. We have an experience of it. We can think about it. We have a concept of apple. And so we cognize it, right? And so it is in this act of cognition, and this is what Hegel is pointing out, that we are able to form a concept of the apple, and we're able to form a knowledge about the apple. Maybe it's a green apple, whatever you want. But because we have this knowledge within us, and this is what he's pointing out here, and this is important, the object, at least on some basic conceptual level, can be said to inhere within consciousness, right? So already things have gotten really complicated, and Hegel hasn't even said anything about object or subjects yet, right? He's just trying to very carefully outline the relation. So what he has done is he's taken what we all take for granted, which is we are subjects, there are things out in the world, and we use and observe and have knowledge of these things. That's very basic. But what he's shown, I think, is that in this very basic assumption of what subjects and objects are and how they relate to one another, he's tried to emphasize for us that when we have a knowledge about the object, we somehow, in the act of forming a knowledge about an object, like a green apple, the concept of the green apple is no longer simply outside of us as an object existing on a table, it is also within us. Right? So he wants to maintain this dualism. Now, when I say dualism, I don't mean that Hegel is a dualist philosopher. That's not true. But I'm using the term dualism just as a way to illustrate for you. And this might be, I mean, maybe you've already read all of this, which is fine. But I'm just using the term to illustrate for you the complex way that Hegel is trying to draw attention to the way subjects and objects might relate to one another. Right? So on the one hand, we have the object outside of us, but insofar as we can have consciousness of this object, we form an idea of it or a concept of it, it then is within us in our thoughts as well, right? So there's this outward, inward process, dialectical relationship that is happening. Okay, well, it gets a bit more complicated, right? Because remember, we're after truth here. We're after the absolute truth. So, Hegel says, if we designate the knowledge that we have of the object, if we designate the knowing as the concept, And what he means by this is, you know, our knowledge is conceptual, right? We see an apple, it's green, we form an idea of it in our head or something, and that is the concept that we're using to have a knowledge about the apple. It is a conceptual knowledge. So if we call this knowing the concept, and if we designate, he says, the truth or the essence in this relationship as the object, that which is outside of us, then he says we are dealing with a correspondence theory of truth, as it were. Because what we're doing is we're seeing if the concepts we form about the objects correspond to the object, right? So if the apple on the table is green, and my concept of it is, oh, this is a red apple because I'm colorblind or something, then of course the knowledge I have of the apple doesn't really correspond to the object, right? But in that relationship, the truth of the matter is on the side of the object. The truth lies in the essence of the object. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Another way, he says, is if we claim that the essence or the truth of the relation, or the truth of the object rather, lies in the concept rather than the object itself. And so the object that is external to us in this case is the concept itself as opposed to just the object. So the green apple on the table is the concept of the green apple on the table as opposed to just the green apple. So the object in this case becomes the concept itself insofar as the concept is an object, or insofar as the concept is, quote, for another, as opposed to just simply for itself. And in this case, he points out the correspondence is reversed, because what we're doing in this case is we're seeing how the object corresponds to our concept. Because remember, in this scenario, the essence or the truth is in the concept, not in the object. Okay, well, so what? So he's just outlined for us two kind of broad general ways of thinking about the object-subject relation. What's his point? Well, his point is that either way, we're describing the same thing. Whether we ascribe truth to the object outside of us or to the concept within us, we are describing the single and same process. And the examination that philosophy ought to do, which is what Hegel does in the Phenomenology, is to understand the relationship between conceptualization on the one hand and the knowing of the truth and its object on the other. And so Hegel points out this is not a matter of applying our thoughts to object. It's a matter of understanding the relationship between the two things. Okay. Well, so what? And so in paragraph 85, Hegel continues. So he says, and he complicates all of this a bit more, unfortunately. So he says, consciousness is consciousness of an object. But at the same time, it is also a consciousness of its own self. Or to put it a different way, we are conscious of an object and we're conscious of the concept we have of the object, right? So not only are we conscious of things that we see and experience, but we are, in a certain sense, self-aware of the fact that we have these experiences. And we are aware of the fact that we have knowledge of these experiences, right? So embedded within consciousness for Hegel is not only the consciousness of an object that is outside of it, or of the concept it has within it, but, and he puts a finer point on this, there's also a consciousness of the knowing of the relationship between the two, right? So if consciousness is consciousness of the true, the consciousness is also a consciousness of the knowing of the truth at the same time. So we know the green apple, we also know that we know the green apple, right? So there's a meta level here that he's highlighting, if that makes sense. There's a higher level of relation that he's pointing out to. And we have a name for this. We call this self-consciousness, right? A self-conscious being is that which is aware of itself as being conscious. It has a notion of individual, it has a concept of its own individuality. So the object seems to be such that consciousness cannot really get behind it. And this is what Hegel uses this term, behind the object, right? So if consciousness is examining an object, it is doing so only insofar as the object appears to consciousness. We cannot seem to get behind the object to see what the object is in itself. This is, of course, the famous Kantian term, and we can get back to that in a little bit. But at the same time, he says consciousness is not really able to test its own knowing of the object. But that is because, he says, consciousness knows of an object. So he says, sorry, let me rephrase that. So Hegel points out that there's a way out of this bind, right? And he says, it is because consciousness knows any object at all, regardless of what that object could be, that there's already a difference between the two. Namely, that something is to consciousness the in itself, that is that which is not a phenomena, it is a noumena, if you want, on the one hand. And the other aspect is the knowing or the being of the object that is for consciousness itself. So here he's talking about the noumena-phenomena distinction, right? So consciousness is aware, Hegel says, or can become aware, that there's a difference between how objects appear to us in experience and how they might be in themselves, totally independent from and divorced from our conscious experience and knowledge of them. And he says, if these two moments, that is our experience of phenomena and objects as they are in themselves, if these two aspects can correspond to each other, then it seems as though consciousness has the truth. But if they do not correspond to each other, which if you know anything about Kant, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit, and Hegel certainly accepts, in some sense, Kant's phenomena-noumena distinction, but he has problems with it. But if our phenomena and noumena, or if our phenomenal experience of objects and their noumenal being does not correspond, then consciousness, he says, must alter its form of knowing to match the object. But of course, remember what we just spoke about, or what I just spoke about the instrument notion of cognition. How if you think of cognition as an instrument, you end up altering the absolute. Well, he says, if consciousness here needs to change itself, change its form of knowing to really apprehend the object, then of course the object also changes. It changes for consciousness. Right? Very quick, maybe simple, strange example. The way we conceive of matter, or I don't know if this example would help, but before we discovered the existence of atoms at the scientific level, we had a pre-atomic, if you will, understanding of matter, right? But once we discovered the existence of atoms, and once we could form knowledge about atoms themselves, then this revolutionized the way we look at the universe, for lack of a better term. And this is what Hegel is pointing out here, is that knowledge, new forms of knowledge, new forms of consciousness, not only alters the subject in a certain respect, but it also alters the object of knowledge for consciousness, right? Yes, so He calls this the dialectical movement of consciousness. And there's another name we have for this, and this is, of course, what he calls experience, or what we all call experience, right? And experience is when the knowing of the subject goes through different formulations and grows and develops along with the subject. And with it, of course, so does the object of consciousness. So I'm just going to kind of end this section on the phenomenology quickly, and then we're going to move on to the encyclopedia. But what I've just kind of described here is just, I think, an example, and just a very minimal sketch of an example of the complexities and nuanced difficulties that the subject-object relation entails. And you may say, okay, well, so what? I mean, so it's complicated. What does this matter? Well, I think this matters because what it points to is that we have to be careful what we mean by objects and what we mean by subjects, right? We have to kind of define these terms. And I realize neither Hegel nor I have defined these terms for you in this presentation, but that is mainly because if I were to try to summarize what I think Hegel means by subjectivity, that would take up my own PhD thesis. And it's a very complicated topic. I would rather not bore you with that, but I am aware of kind of the self-irony here. I haven't defined the subject either. But remember, and this is important, here Hegel has kind of just assumed that we're talking about a human, well, not human, but we're talking about a conscious subject that forms knowledge of an object. And he pointed this out, right? He said, we don't want to make any conceptual presuppositions because this could lead us into error. And so if you've read the Phenomenology, you know that what Hegel does is he then eventually says, look, we have to just follow the experience of consciousness, and consciousness itself, without philosophy's help, becomes philosophical, becomes absolute, has a cognition of truth, and so on. But I just want to kind of highlight the nuanced complexities that goes with the very rudimentary subject-object distinction that we all seemingly carry around with us and we don't really question, right? So we all kind of assume that object exists outside of us. But as I've kind of pointed out here, and as Hegel himself argues, even that rudimentary distinction is a very complicated, complex relationship. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to move on to the Encyclopedia Logic very quickly to talk about empiricism. And then we're going to speak about speculative philosophy. And finally, we're going to just kind of end with the distinction between and the relation between idealism and realism. So what is wrong with empiricism? So Hegel, in his Encyclopedia Logic, in the introduction, he outlines kind of 3 or 4 broad positions to objectivity. And these positions, as he calls them, are different formulations that thought can take when it wants to think about that which is objective. And when I say objective in this case, I don't necessarily mean that which is universally true, because I think in a kind of common day non-philosophical language, it's very common to say, oh, this is objectively true. Science has objective truth. And by this, people usually mean something which isn't just arbitrary and opinion and subjective. It is something that is proved to be true, irrespective of people's opinions. That's not really what Hegel is speaking about here when he means objectivity. What he means is not only objects, but also the ways the subject can think about objects, right? All right, and these various positions correspond to the history of European philosophy. So, empiricism, and Hegel primarily here is thinking of David Hume. So he has problems with this, right? So he makes a few observations about how empiricism operates, and then he critiques it a little bit. But again, remember what we just discussed about the subject and the object and the nuanced relationship, because I think that's all in the background here. So Hegel says, look, for the empiricist, truth is found in the content of our perceptions, and we obtain these contents from experience, right? Empiricism raises this content to create universal representations or laws or principles. But these are only deemed to be philosophically legitimate for the empiricist only insofar as they have been exhibited in experiences, right? So if you've read Hume, if you know anything about philosophical empiricism, Hume said, well, how do we form the notion of gravity, or rather, how does scientific laws come about philosophically? And Hegel's answer is we form these universal laws through habits, and we form habits through repeated experiences that we perceive in our experiences, as it were. So for Hume, there are no kind of universally a priori laws that hold the universe together. These are all entirely habitual. A quick 101 philosophy recap of Hume. Okay, but in this case, says Hegel, so the truth for the empiricist, according to Hegel, relies on experience, entirely on experience. And he points out even the subject's certainty of itself for the empiricist is to be found in its conscious perceptions of its own experience, right? So even the subject's validity of itself as a subject for the empiricist, argues Hegel, is grounded in experience. It is all experience, right? There are no a priori notions of the subject. That is ridiculous according to the Humean skeptic or the Humean empiricist. But this is a little bit perplexing and not convincing or persuasive for Hegel. As he points out, and this is in paragraph 38, in the remark of the readings, if you're following along. In the remark, Hegel points out that empiricism makes use of metaphysical a priori concepts all the time. Empiricists talk about things like universality or the singular or the one and the many, the individual, but they do so unconsciously. They do so without recognizing that they're doing so. They know not what they do, to paraphrase Marx. And Hegel says this is arrogant and ignorant on their part. It is delusional because it is a very uncritical manner of thinking about objectivity. So on the one hand, empiricism shuns and mocks traditional metaphysics, but in its shunning and mocking of metaphysics, it ends up reproducing that which is shunned and that which it seeks to shun and mock. So in other words, empiricism is a bit contradictory for Hegel because it seeks to ground everything in experience, but it makes use of universal concepts that aren't necessarily entirely founded upon experience anyway. So it doesn't know what it's doing for Hegel. All right, so Hegel recognizes that in experience, we have two broad elements that are operating at the same time. And he says empiricism is aware of these two elements, right? So on the one hand, experience is made up of a manifold of materials, right? You open your eyes, you see different things, you hear different sounds. There's a multiplicity of things. That's one aspect. The second aspect, Hegel says, and he thinks empiricism is aware of this, right? The second aspect is that empiricism is able to form determinations about the multitude in a necessary and universal manner. But there's a problem. He says, well, empiricism recognizes that there's a multiplicity of materials given in our experiences. It does not conceptualize this manifold in terms of a universal. And it is, so what it means by this is that the empiricist might admit that, yes, of course, there is a large multiplicity of things that we perceive, But that's it. The empiricist doesn't go beyond that conception. It doesn't say, well, we can form a universal understanding of what we're perceiving. It just says we have a large amount, or we have a large multitude of something. So it doesn't really, at least not explicitly, rely on the notion of the universal. That's one thing. Likewise, complains Hegel, the empiricist, although it can account for the succession of objects in our experiences. For example, if I let go of a pen and the pen drops, the empiricist says very rudimentally that, okay, we have two perceptions. We have you holding the pen. That's one perception. We have the perception and the experience of the pen falling. And in our imagination, we just kind of associate these two things and unite them, and we can form a knowledge claim. We can establish their connection, right? We can account for philosophically how a pen might fall to the ground if we drop it. Okay, says Hegel, empiricism acknowledges this. However, it doesn't establish any necessary connection. Remember, for the Humean empiricist, we cannot form any a priori necessary laws of nature, right? So even though we can kind of connect successive perceptions that we have in experience, the empiricist cannot and does not rely on any necessary connection, because to impart necessity to this connection would be to do metaphysics, which is what the empiricist says they're not really doing, right? So the empiricist, as I mentioned before, rather relies on the contingent and somewhat arbitrary formation of habits and customs for its validity. But this isn't enough for Hegel, right? Because remember what we just kind of spoke about the subject-object relationship in the phenomenology. The empiricist isn't really able to account for the nuance of the relationship between the subject and the object. Its notion of subjectivity is limited and one-sided for Hegel. And he doesn't find any of this convincing. And to top it all off, empiricism becomes contradictory because it relies on metaphysical concepts, which it says it does not rely upon. So empiricism as a way of thinking objectivity falls into a lot of conceptual confusion and problems, and it's not consistent. So Hegel thinks philosophy as a proper science can't be empiricist, because empiricists don't know what they're talking about when they are talking about experience. So empiricism is out of the window. And so the third readings we did, which is Hegel's own position. So you might be thinking, well, okay, fine, Hegel, if empiricism is out the window, then what are we left with? What do we do? How can we think objectivity? Are we not just stuck within a subjective idealism or something like this? And the answer is not necessarily, but Hegel will explain this. So the final position towards objectivity that thought can assume is what Hegel calls the speculative position, or the speculative philosophy position. And this position, he says, has three moments, three parts, or rather three aspects. Let me put it that way. And these are, firstly, the abstract side of the understanding, or the faculty of the understanding. Secondly, the dialectical, or the negatively rational side. And third and finally, the speculative, or the positively rational side. If you're following, this is paragraph 79 in the readings. It's the third reading that we did. So he warns us that these three moments of the speculative position aren't three different parts. That is, they're not entirely separated. Rather, they constitute the very moments of every and any logical thought whatsoever. And so they're linked and they're connected in some way. And he kind of explains this a little bit. And I have a few examples, so hopefully this won't get too abstract. So the first moment, what he calls abstract or the understanding, is a sort of thinking that relies on fixed or rigid concepts. For example, the subject and the object, right? So the understanding would, for example, assume and not question that the subject is opposed to the object, and these two concepts or categories are fixed. They have a relationship, but they are entirely different. They're distinct. They're not really identical in any kind of sense. So the understanding, says Hegel, freezes the concepts in their place. It doesn't let them move, or as we will say later on, it doesn't let them negate one another or sublate one another. The understanding operates by abstracting from all particular content. And in doing so, it creates what Hegel calls the abstract universal. And I have a relevant and perhaps a political example of this. And I think Zizek was the first one to use this example. So credit goes to Slavoj Žižek for this. The statement, all lives matter, which we've all heard of, is for Hegel an abstract universal, because its claim is that all lives matter. The universal it uses is abstract and vague, right? Quote unquote, it is all. We don't know who is included in this all. It is assumed that it is universally everyone, but it's empty, right? It's an empty abstract conception, because we can't say anything about this statement, all lives matter. Whose lives? What lives? Where? How many? Right? On the other hand, the statement, Black Lives Matter, is what he calls a concrete universal, because it specifically highlights a particular group or a particular subsection of a universal and makes that into the universal. So to put this in maybe more politically and socially phrased terms that might explain what Hegel is meaning here, basically what this means is that what he's describing in a certain respect, and this is what Zizek pointed to in one of his articles, the abstract universal is exclusionary, right? Because it's abstract, because you abstract from the content you're trying to universalize. It's an abstraction. And so in the same way how the phrase all lives matter completely ignores and in fact excludes the real political legitimacy and concern of the statement Black Lives Matter, the abstract universal also excludes and ignores the particular content, right? So the understanding as a way of thinking objectivity operates in abstracts. It operates for Hegel in abstract universals. And not only this, the understanding remains within finite determinations. That is to say, it is completely content within the separated and limited terms that are opposed to each other, right? So subject and object, freedom and necessity, think of any conceptual contradictory terms you want. The understanding will say, great, that's fine. I have no problem with it. The subject is over here, the object is over there. That's fine. They're separated, there's a limit, and they're opposite. Cool, great. But there's a problem with this, and that is, and Hegel will spend many, many pages throughout all of his writings showing how all of these finite determinations are contradictory, and it is through their contradiction that they then transform themselves and sublate themselves, and it is how new concepts and new terms are formed. And to capture that process, this is what the second moment of speculative philosophy does. This is what he calls the dialectical moment, right? Or the negatively rational moment. So the dialectical moment is the self-sublation or the self-transformation, if you want, or the self-negation of the finite determinations. In fact, of the very finite determinations that the understanding was assuming to be fixed, right? So this is important because I think a lot of people will just assume that for Hegel, speculative philosophy is entirely unrelated and different from what he calls the understanding, which is basically broadly a Kantian perspective or a very kind of common sense perspective. And this is not the case. For Hegel, what he calls speculative reason or dialectical philosophy emerges within and out of and through what he just called the understanding, right? So it's immanent to the understanding's way of conceiving of things. So if the understanding assumes that the subject and object are separate and distinct and not related, then dialectical philosophy or the dialectical moment of speculative philosophy will show how these very oppositional terms contradict one another and they negate one another and they transform themselves, right? So they don't remain fixed or rigid. They connect in some way. We're almost at the end. Don't worry. I appreciate your patience. So Hegel points out that dialectical thought is able to better capture the true content of the understanding than the understanding itself, right? So just think, so the slogan Black Lives Matter captures the truth of the social political situation of racism in America as a slogan better than the slogan All Lives Matter. That's essentially what Hegel is pointing out here, is that the dialectical way of thinking is better, is closer to the truth, let's say, than the understanding will ever be, because the understanding makes a lot of assumptions. So he says the dialectical process is the negation. Remember, he calls this the negatively rational. And it is a negation whereby the content of the understanding is immanently to the understanding itself, transformed or sublated or changed. As I just said, the understanding, Hegel thinks, is incapable of grasping how everything finite and limited is by definition, that is by being finite, self-negating and self-transforming for that matter, right? To be finite is to perish, and to perish is to, as Hegel says, sublate oneself. So his point is that the understanding misses this, right? Okay, so the dialectical moment is that moment of self-negation. So he goes on and he notes that the dialectical moment constitutes the scientific progression of philosophy, its immanent necessity, and all of this is kind of internal to thinking as such. Finally, remember there's three moments here. The third moment he's describing that we've arrived at is the speculative moment, or the positively rational. So if dialectical philosophy, or if rather the dialectical moment is negating, then the speculative is positing and positive, and in a sense, affirmative, right? So the speculative grasps the unity of the determinations which were just sublated a moment ago, and in their self-sublation, it grasped the affirmative nature that was contained within them, that emerges out of their dissolution as fixed opposite concepts. And as such, the result is something different and perhaps slightly new. So Hegel says, speculative philosophy or speculative reason does not deal with abstract, empty thoughts or concepts, but on the other hand, but rather it is concrete, not abstract. So it deals with thought determinations, but these determinations are concrete determinations, as opposed to the abstract, empty determinations of the understanding. Okay, so we're finally at the last bit of the readings, and I'm going to wrap up very quickly because I'm conscious of the time. And then hopefully we can have some Q&A. Okay, so the last readings I kind of wanted people to do is from a remark in the Science of Logic, where Hegel is briefly discussing idealism and realism. So I'm going to give a brief overview of this, and then I'll end, and then we can maybe have a bit of a discussion. So the first thing Hegel says here, and it's quite a bold claim. He claims that every philosophy is at some level an idealism, or he says it has idealism for its principle. For this reason, he argues the difference between idealism and realism, and we can maybe bracket in materialism here as well, along with realism. The difference between these two things for philosophy is meaningless, because realisms or materialisms always already, for Hegel, contain a certain form of idealist concepts. So he says, all philosophy, even those that argue that what is ontologically and fundamentally true are things like matter or atoms, things that are outside of the subject, even those philosophical positions for Hegel are idealisms, for the simple fact, he says, that they make use of metaphysical concepts. The term matter, quote unquote, is a concept, right? We may say, okay, matter refers to something that isn't just conceptual. Fine. But as I tried to illustrate to you when we spoke about the phenomenology, to just simply assert that matter is somehow outside of the subject presupposes a lot of things. And it presupposes a knowledge of objectivity that Hegel thinks materialism, or in this case, he's thinking about Greek atomism, doesn't seek to demonstrate. That the Greek atomists simply assume that we can have cognition and knowledge of the atoms that they think make up the universe. So essentially, just like how empiricism makes use of concepts it does not recognize, or just how empiricism, Hegel thinks, unconsciously uses metaphysics, so too any philosophy, even a realism, will use concepts. So he says, terms like matter or nous or water or whatever it is, these are universals. These are concepts. They are what he calls idealizations. And idealizations are typically thought to be any representations we may have constructed. In a very kind of common sense way of thinking about them, we all typically think of that which is idealized as describing an imaginary construction, you know. For example, I had a very idealized assumption of how this Zoom talk would go. But here I am talking to you using my iPhone because this weekend my internet cut out in my flat. So I'm a little bit, I'm making do with it, if you see what I mean. So we use the term idealism or the idealized in a kind of in an imaginary sense, right? But in doing so, we contrast it with the real, right? So we can have an idealized imaginary concept of a unicorn, or an idealized assumption of what might happen in the American election. But our imaginary construction is always contraposed and distinct from and stands over against that which is quote unquote real. To put it simply, we assume the distinction between realism and idealism. Which, as we've just kind of discussed, right, in terms of how Hegel thinks the ways in which we can think about objectivity, Hegel tried to demonstrate that when we think about fixed terms like idealism versus realism, or the subject versus the object, we are stuck within a very particular mode of thinking. what he called the understanding. And if we're stuck within that mode of thinking, we miss and assume a lot of things that will lead us astray and will lead to contradictions, right? So what he's pointing out here, I think, although he doesn't really say it explicitly, but nevertheless, you can make an argument, I think, what he's drawing attention to is that we ourselves are stuck in a finite, rigid conception of idealism and realism if we assume that they're opposed and contrasted, right? Because, and Hegel doesn't ask this, but I'm asking this in the spirit of Hegel for you here tonight. If you think idealism and realism are two opposite conceptions of doing philosophy, Hegel's question to you would be, and remember, I pointed this out earlier about the skepticism of Hegel, right? He's more skeptic than the skeptics. His question to you would be, well, how do you know idealism and realism are assumed or are contrasted? Are you making this assumption? What definition of realism are you using? What is the real? What is the ideal? How can you prove the ideal isn't real? How can you prove the real is real, right? So he's warning us here that if we assume that which is idealized to be simply a flight of fancy, imaginary construction, we fall back into a position of the understanding. We separate and hold distinct two concepts and two terms, which may not necessarily be that distinct or different. And so Hegel's question to you would be, if you're a hardcore materialist or a hardcore idealist or whatever, or a realist, what kind of notions of subjectivity and objectivity are you using? But furthermore, what kind of notions of idealism and realism are you using? Right? So he points out that what he calls subjective idealism, and this, by subjective idealism, he's thinking of Fichte, but also of Kant in some sense. So a subjective idealist position is an idealism, but only insofar as it is the form of representation of the content that it has for consciousness. So think about Kant, right? Kant is an idealist in a certain respect. And Hegel points out, Kant's idealism is formal because it is only concerned with the representation of the content that a subject can have. So this formal idealism for Hegel is taken to be the truth. That is, the subjective idealist takes this position to be the truth. But he says it thereby excludes objectivity or the reality of its idealist content. This idealism, namely the subjective idealist, is formal since it fails to take into account and demonstrate the validity of its content. That is, the content it has a representation of. And so in this respect, Hegel says this kind of idealism remains within finite determinations. It cannot get beyond finitude. And I said beyond finitude purposefully, because if you've read Milius's essay, which we'll talk about next week, this is what he calls his philosophical position, the notion of getting beyond finitude. Well, Hegel said it first, so Hegel wins in that respect, I think. Okay, we're almost done here, don't worry. So Hegel ends by commenting that this kind of formal idealism is very basic in the sense that nothing is lost. You have finite determinations, you have subjects and objects and thoughts and things outside of thought and so on, but nothing is gained either. It's kind of your down the line centrist neoliberal political candidate. Kind of very lukewarm, basic position to be in. Nothing is gained, nothing is lost. And he also points out that, of course, and I'm going to end on this in a second, that the opposition between subjectivity and objectivity, of course, and I'm just reminding us here, is itself one of these finite determinations that Hegel said were ascribed and assumed by the understanding. And the finite understanding just kind of takes it for granted that the subject and the object are separate and distinct. And it is only the speculative position that Hegel has outlined that is able to go beyond or sublate this distinction. So, how this is possible, that is how we can get beyond the subject-object dualism, and how this relates to the issue of the subject and the issue of materialism, is something that we'll be speaking about next week in more detail. But just as a way of a preview, I think it is only through dialectical materialism, with the help of Hegel and Marx and others, that we can have a materialism that properly goes beyond the subject. But it can only go beyond the subject, or it can only decenter the subject's position, if you will, if it recognizes in a very paradoxical way, and in a very self-reflexive way, that the subject is necessary. That in fact, we cannot get beyond the subject because it is an impossibility. If we want to get beyond the subject, we have to first recognize that this is impossible, because we are subjects and we are thinking beings. And because of this impossibility, we can nevertheless get beyond the subject in a specific way. That is to say, and this is the last thing I'll say, if we recognize that this is an impossibility, we are in a certain sense stuck with ourselves. Right? If we're subjects, we're stuck with ourselves as subjects. But this being stuck with oneself, this selfhood, is not, and this is what we'll talk about next week, is not exclusionary. It is not a closed position to be in. On the contrary, this notion of subjectivity, I think, is inclusive of the other, and this includes within it the outside world. And in this sense, it is a materialism that retains the position of the subject. And if you're curious to see what that means, we can talk about this next week, because that is the topic of next week. All right, thank you very much. I thank you for your patience, and I'll end it here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Borna. Let's start with the questions and comments, if anybody wants to join.
Borna, can is it okay if I ask a quick question? I was struck by your claim at the opening of your presentation, which is great, by the way. I thoroughly enjoyed it. That to decenter the subject, we kind of need a theory, an account of what the subject is. And I hope that doesn't misrepresent what you said. So that there needs to be some, in a sense, some delineation of what subjectivity is before we can hope to go beyond it. And I wonder both whether that's true and also whether that's viable. I mean, do we need to suppose that there is sort of one kind of structure or one field that we mean when we talk about the subject, or that we have access to that field? I guess coming from my position, I'm actually quite skeptical of the idea that there is some transcendental account of subjectivity that we can access kind of a priori, and which is in a sense cognitively accessible, just as I guess skeptical about whether we need to suppose that there is some sort of theory of the concept in general that we can access. So I'm maybe this is a bit too abstract, because in a sense this is almost coming in at the very beginning of your talk, rather than looking at the kind of rich Hegelian interpretation of that subjectivity. But it just seems to me that if we question that kind of ability to totalize subjectivity, then we also question whether there is a meta level implicit in consciousness, whereby consciousness, in a sense, already grasps its own, implicitly grasps its own nature as subjectivity, as, if you like, consciousness of itself.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good, important question. Well, I mean, I kind of leave that as an open question, I think, on purpose, because I myself don't necessarily have a thorough definitive answer to this, although I am leaning towards, which is what I mentioned in the beginning, that it seems to me on some level that and this is kind of what maybe Hegel points out in the introduction to the Phenomenology, that on some level we philosophy, whatever philosophy wants to have a claim to, it needs to kind of well, it cannot make any presuppositions. Let me start there. Now, you might say, okay, but wait a minute. I can write a paper and argue as you did, David. People can write papers without necessarily defining the notion of the subject, and kind of point to or hint at different activities. You use art in your presentation, different forms of literature that don't rely on any notion of subjectivity, right? So in what sense are those forms of philosophical pursuits? So I suppose one question you might have for me, so I'm asking myself a question that you might have for me here, which is, do we need to presuppose the subject? Or rather, are we really presupposing a notion of the subject if we don't really talk about the subject, right? In any kind of thorough way. I think sort of that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe that was the direction of your question. And I think it's a complicated answer. On the one hand, I would say it depends what it is that philosophy is doing. So if you are, if you're not claiming to, in a sense, go beyond or get outside of the subject, then your philosophy has no reliance upon subjectivity, at least in an explicit sense, right? For example, if you take Milieu's position in After Finitude, he very openly says his project is to get at the great outside, go beyond the kind of correlationist circle, right? Which correlates thought and being, which is kind of embedded within the subjective position in Kantian and in post-Kantian philosophy in some respects. So Milieu there, for example, is interested in getting beyond the subject. But of course, and I don't mean to make this sound, I don't want this to be seen as a sort of a cheeky, non-serious jab at Milieu or something. But in a very serious philosophical sense, I think there is a bit of a problem, right? So if you want to go beyond something, you have to really know that which is you're trying to go beyond, I think. Because how do you know that you've gone beyond it if you don't know what it is you're trying to get beyond? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah,
so,
that's a presentation of Milieu. I mean, I guess the position I was sketching out was perhaps different from that, which because I think Milieu in a sense presupposes a kind of model of subjectivity in order to get outside it, for sure. But right. I'm not sure that that's absolutely necessary. I'm not sure if I was developing some form of speculative philosophy that I'd want to start where he starts.
Sure.
So
It's yes. Well. If you do attend the next session, and because I think Hegel complicates this issue a little bit more. So here he's in the introduction to the phenomenology. He's of course speaking about consciousness and so on. And I alluded to aren't we presupposing a notion of the subject if we're trying to get beyond it? But I think there's a stronger claim to make, and this is what I argue in my chapter, which is one of the readings, an article I wrote, which I tried to argue that you can use Hegel to, I use Milieu as an example, but that there is a meta level or a self-reflexive element here, right? Because in some sense, we are human beings, we are sorts of subjects, we engage in thought, and Hegel has things to say about all of those things. And so Hegel thinks that whenever a thinking being thinks, they're thinking concepts. To think is to conceptualize. There is no form of thinking that is not conceptual for Hegel. So if that is true, then any form of conceptualization is in some sense any form of thinking relies upon a certain subjective, and by subjective I mean a certain subject that is doing the thinking, no? And on a meta self-reflexive level, we're all philosophers writing papers about this stuff and writing books about this stuff. So Hegel would say, well, wait a minute, and this is what I argue in my paper, there is a performative contradiction at work here on some level, on some meta self-reflexive level. We have subjects, we have human beings writing papers about getting beyond the subject. And the whole thing from a Hegelian dialectical point of view is kind of self-defeating and self-contradictory and strange and odd and weird. So now whether or not that argument, and this is next week's session in a bit more detail, so we'll discuss this next week, I'm saying, but whether or not that argument is a problem for your position, David, I don't know. It might not be. And in that case, great, you have eluded the Hegelian contradiction.
I wouldn't presume so much, but you certainly whetted my appetite for next week. Thanks. That's
yes,
great.
Yes. So thank you. That was a good question.
Thank you so much, Borna, for this really awesome and interesting talk. I want to better understand the phase of the speculative phase of positive reason, or the phase of the concept. I'm wondering, in my mind, I understand the first and second phase. The first phase, the phase of being, or the phase of the abstract, as basically the experience of going through the forms of knowing the object. Then the second phase, aka essence or dialectical negative reason, is a reflection on the forms of knowing the object. And correct me if I misunderstand there, but I don't know what the third phase, the speculative phase, is doing necessarily, other than maybe a very extra rigorous expansion of the second phase of reflecting on the ways of knowing rather than knowing the object in multiple ways. So I was hoping you could help me understand that better.
Right. Yes, thanks for your question. And I mean, if all of this is, I mean, I should say it is Hegel we're speaking about, and Hegel is notorious for his dense writing and abstract language and so on. And although I'm doing my PhD on Hegel, and I've been reading this stuff for years and years and years, I'm by no means the master. I don't think anyone is really the master of Hegel. So confusion and difficulty is part of the process. So the relation between the second and the third, which is what you were alluding to in the speculative way of thinking. So the second moment is the dialectical moment, right? And Hegel's point is that that moment is able to kind of understand the ways in which the kind of fixed and rigid framework that the understanding works in, how that framework is kind of problematic, right? So I gave the all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter example. And in a certain respect, you can kind of you can kind of see how the statement "all lives matter," at least I hope we would all agree, is politically ridiculous and problematic for a lot of reasons, right? But the position of the understanding, which is the first moment, doesn't recognize the problems. It just kind of says, well, look, a universal is that which is abstract, and because the abstract universal for Hegel abstracts from all kind of particular things, right? And it's only until we get to the second moment, the dialectical moment, where thinking or thought, and by thinking and thought, it just means any being that can think like this, right? It is only in the second moment that we can recognize the fixed way in which the understanding thought about things, like all lives matter, is full of problems. It assumes an allness that is at the same time exclusionary and thereby not universal. It completely ignores the experiences of Black Americans and so on. So like you can draw up a laundry list of issues, the first way of thinking about things. But Hegel's point is that the problems, the problems lie on the side, if you want, of thinking, not so much on the side of the object. But even this distinction between different sides is a bit problematic. But you know what I mean. So if the issue at hand is racism in America, for example, the understanding says, great, all lives matter, right? But the issue in that statement is a conceptual issue. It has to do with the way that the understanding or the people who say all lives matter, it has to do in how they think about the issue, which is racism, right? So this is kind of Hegel's point, is that it is only when we recognize the issues in the conceptual framework of the understanding, namely the first moment, that we're then able to see that it leads to, that it's self-defeating, that it's contradictory. And as Hegel points out, it is self-negating, right? And it is because it is self-negating that it then transforms itself. And by itself here, he means the original framework of the understanding that works in oppositions and says the subject is on this side, the object is on this side, and so on. Now the third moment, and sorry, I'm getting to your question in a roundabout way, but the third moment is different from the second, because what are we left with at the second moment? We're just left with the disillusion of that framework, the original framework, right? So in the example we're using, it's like someone saying all lives matter, and someone says, that's a stupid thing to say, you're an idiot, here are the reasons, and then doesn't correct them and just stops at the negative. Remember, Hegel calls the dialectical moment the negatively rational side. And the point is that thought or thinking or logical thinking for Hegel, philosophy can't be content with just the disillusion, because for Hegel a negation or a sublation is not simply a canceling out of something, it transforms it, right? So you can't get stuck at the second moment, because then you would just be that person who just complains at everybody all the time without kind of giving a positive viewpoint, to put it, to use the example, right? So the fix here for Hegel is the third moment, which then points to the affirmative aspect inherent in the first moment. To use the example, the speculative or the third moment in the Black Lives Matter example we're using would be someone saying, okay, you just said all lives matter. Here's why that is not true, and that statement is ignorant and problematic and so on. However, here's where we can still get to all lives actually mattering, and it isn't by saying all lives matter, it's by saying Black lives matter for all of these reasons, right? So the third moment for Hegel is able to get at an affirmative positive claim through the wreckage that the second moment caused in the first moment's construction. Let me put it that way, right? So this is the speculative and final part. But remember, these aren't three different parts. This is all one continuous process of thinking for Hegel, right? So all of this is imminent to the original framework. So we can only get at this, or we can only properly understand and articulate and express the truth of the statement Black Lives Matter by showing why the original framework of saying all lives matter falls apart, why it's problematic, why the claim to allness is not really universal in the first place, right? And it is only by doing all of that that then you can affirm a concrete universal through the statement of Black Lives Matter, or through what he calls a concrete universal, which affirms rather than negates. I hope that answered your question. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too long of an answer, but.
Hi.
Yeah, it certainly did. Thank you.
Hi, I don't know if I'm coming through because my internet's really bad.
Thank you. So I'm trying to find you. I'm scrolling through.
Amanda somewhere. Thank you very much for this great exposition of Hegel. And David's point made me think, I was kind of thinking something similar, David, but I guess what your talk reminded me of was when you first mentioned, the decentering of the subject. It reminded me so much of how the decentering of the subject is very much taken as a kind of given in itself. In the sense, what I mean is that it's really done very much uncritically by many people in many practices. And it's claimed as this kind of redemptive space of indeterminacy, as we've known after kind of post-68 politics and whatnot. So in many ways, the decentering of the subject claims like a political force, but I think in the terms of how you talked about subjective idealism, it kind of doesn't go anywhere because it doesn't take objectivity seriously. So I kind of had a question, and this is a really messy question, so bear with me, about progress. And I wanted to kind of engage this question or this idea of progress because I know how unfashionable it is in the face of many people who are assuming that the decentering of the subject is a site of potentiality and possibility in itself, but don't want to kind of deal with the problems of empiricism, i.e. the grip or attraction in actual political landscapes. So I kind of want you to think about how in what I see as like how dialectical mechanisms and systems that have been kind of structured and engineered for us to think objectivity have actually been naturalized and kind of mythologized in various ways and have their own kind of subjective idealist kind of character. And what it then means to kind of reorientate or rethink productive dialectical structures that can engage with concepts like progress again, and how we might do that, because that brings us back to that kind of distinction between emergence and natural consciousness and this idea of the instrument. So I'm kind of really interested in that, or what you think about that. I don't know if I've made any sense, but I guess I guess my problem lies in the normative kind of or mythologized ideas of decentering that are actually incorrect and contradictory, and to actually think about, for want of better words, many people have talked about this, but constructive alienation, rather than trying to overcome alienation in the name of reconstituting a kind of voluntaristic free will, or glorifying decentered subjectivity in the name of the open, right? The mythology of the open. So I'm happy to clarify further if you want me to, but I guess, yeah, progress is something very interesting to me in this context. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Can I just maybe ask what you mean by the term progress? Do you mean like social political progress or
I mean a concept of how we can understand what we might see as, so no, not necessarily social political at all, but what it is to have a correct conception of the way in which reason operates, right? So what is it to kind of have a productive understanding of the identity between concept and object?
Right.
So what
Right.
is
Yes. Okay. I see. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Right. Well, that's sort of the underlying thrust of all of this, right? Which is that, I mean, you know, I'm not saying everyone stop and read Hegel. I mean, that would be great, but that's not really my argument here. Neither am I saying we should all just be dialectical materialists or Marxists and things will be fine. So I'm going to deal with this kind of political historical element first, and then get back to your more conceptual point about progression. So of course, I'm well aware that this is kind of post 68. We politically and historically, we are facing the Anthropocene. We are facing the destruction of, in some sense, you could say, the world that is not just entirely subjective, right? The natural world, whatever you want to call it. And so some have argued, and we can talk about this more next week if you attend, because some people have argued, look, we need to decenter the subject because of political reasons, because anthropomorphic ways of thinking about ourselves and our universe have led to a lot of problems, and they're insufficient to deal with something like the climate crisis, to deal with problems that aren't entirely human, right? So that's one. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there are those who are doing contemporary philosophy today who make this kind of an argument for why they think we ought to get beyond the subject and not have a hierarchical understanding of beings where the human subject is on top and everything else comes after. You see what I mean? So for political reasons, some people say, look, we have to do this. I mean, I'm not convinced by that. Because I mean, there's lots of problems with that move, not only conceptual or metaphysical. Namely, is it possible to do this? Can we really get beyond subjects? But also politically, as you know, and others like Andreas Malm have argued this as well. They've argued that the idea that the solution to something like the climate crisis is a way of thinking that is not centered on human agents that can enact the political will to change that which is harming the environment, namely fossil fuels and pollution and so on, is strange. So Malm's point, and I think it's a good one, is that on the contrary, rather than decenter the subject to fix climate change, we need more subjectivity. We need more people being subjectively, politically galvanized to tackle this problem. Because nature isn't going to solve climate change. We have to do it as political subjects. That's Malm's argument in a nutshell. And this is sort of, and I generally agree with this in some sense, politically. So that's the political historical aspect of it. But to your main question, which is about progression, I would say that, well, yes, all these, I tried to hint at this in the beginning, which was David's question to me. Which, all this business about possibly getting beyond or outside of the subject or decentering the subject, logically, don't they assume, either explicitly or perhaps implicitly, a working concept of subjectivity that they think we ought to get beyond, right? So if by subjectivity they mean the human, rational, modern, Cartesian subject, okay, but in some sense, we have sort of gone beyond that philosophically already. And on the other hand, we have also, it's not clear that, why this would be desirable, even if it were possible, right? So this notion of decentering or going beyond the subject, as I've tried to kind of point out to, maybe indirectly through my talk, isn't conscious of the subject-object relation, assumes that it's a relationship that is framed within the understanding's framework, namely they're distinct, we are subjects, Objects are out there. Let's focus on objects because we've been focused on subjectivity for so long. This is kind of generally what the thrust seems to be to me. And if there are people who listening who think, well, that's not what I think, or that's not what so-and-so argues, I'm aware that there are very minute differences among people who are working on this sort of thing today. And I'm not naming names or anything on purpose. Next week, I'm going to look at Milieu a little bit as an example. But generally, philosophically, I think yes, so just to answer your question, and then we can move on. What I would say is, it seems to me that the idea of decentering or going beyond the subject kind of assumes the position of the understanding, right? Kind of assumes this kind of common sense, familiar view that the subject equals the human being, equals human thought, equals anthropomorphism, and the object is something that is outside of all of that, that is in the external world, that is beyond the subject, that exists outside of our thoughts. And Hegel's whole point is, whoa, wait a minute, you're using a lot of concepts here you haven't defined. What the F is going on? His point is that you have to be more careful, right? Because that position, it does make an assumption that subjects are like this, objects are like that. And so my issue is that they make this assumption, and in some sense they're not entirely aware of it, or some of them might be aware and they just kind of shrug it off. They don't care. Not everyone wants to be as conceptually consistent as Hegel, and they don't really care if they're self-contradictory. But I mean, if you're contradicting yourself, then what are you really saying, I suppose? Anyway, I hope that sort of answered your question.
Well, yeah.
And if not, we can.
I don't want to
I
don't want to monopolize it, but I guess what I was interested in was this question of like time, and when I talked about progress and consciousness, is that you have on the one hand this idea that a subject is constituted historically, retroactively, in the sense that the subject is conscious of its incompleteness or incompatibility in Hegel's narrative, and then also see a narrative of where through spirit there is a kind of adequation between the consciousness and a realized science. So you don't have to answer me now or anything like that, but I'm just saying that's what I was kind of also interested in, and that's what drove some of that question on progress. But I'll let other people.
Yes. Well, thanks. And this is this is sort of the topic of my PhD thesis in some sense, not so the issue of progress and time in Hegel in relation to subjectivity or freedom. So I'm working on it. I'm writing it as we speak. So I'll just kind of leave it there. But it is a very important, big, because it's not clear what really Hegel means by the subject anyway. Because he just doesn't mean the human subject. He just doesn't mean the Cartesian cogito, right? Because it is a subject, it is also a substance or an object, and so it has a very ontological position for Hegel that is not reducible to cognition, right? So there's that happening as well. Great, but thank you. I do think we have some questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to speak using the mic, feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, I got a question. Yeah, so there's like, first of all, thank you so much for the talk. Very helpful. Spending a lot of time thinking about absolute knowing. So this is really, really clarifying in a certain register. A few things I want to kind of zero in on is like, one, the tension between thinking and knowing, right? And I think you had a moment where you said to think is always on some level for Hegel conceptual, right? This was in response to David, I think. And I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts more on the maybe tension between representational thinking and conceptual cognition or something like this. Yeah, and how that like kind of fits into this schema.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I would say that that there is a distinction here for Hegel, I think. On the one hand, to take representational thinking or knowing, and I did speak about this a little bit in the presentation on the phenomenology, because Hegel points this out, right? He says, well, look, if we have, if we're making claims to knowledge, right, there's something going on there that is not entirely or purely conceptual or logical, right? Because there's the knowledge that we want to obtain on the one hand, and the content of the knowledge itself, right? So, stupid example, I want to know what kind of apples my flatmate bought. I open the fridge, and bam, they're red apples, right? So I have a knowledge, namely red apples. But there's a distinction there, right, between the knowledge that I obtain and the content of that knowledge. So representational knowing, or thinking, if you want to call it this, it's in the word. It's in the word representation. You're representing something to something else, right? So thought or thinking or consciousness stands distinct or separate in some sense to that which is the content of its thought, if you can follow me, right? So representational thinking represents the content to itself. It's not immanent to it necessarily, right? Now, conceptual thinking or pure logical thinking, as Hegel calls it, does not represent things to itself, because as Hegel argues in the Science of Logic and in his logical texts, logical thought gives itself its own content. It doesn't represent anything. Logical concepts for Hegel aren't metaphors. They don't need to correspond to an object, right? Which is why no one reads the Science of Logic, because it's 800 pages of Hegel just abstractly talking about logical categories. It's maddening and bewildering. But his point is, okay, when you think conceptually, you are thinking in abstract terms, but this doesn't mean they're empty. So you're thinking abstractly, but you're thinking of things like individuality, universality, what is being, what is nothing, what does negation mean, and so on, essence, form, phenomena, noumena, object, in itself, for itself. You're thinking in abstract language, but as opposed to representational thinking, which has a distinction between its content and the thing that it's thinking, conceptual thought doesn't have this distinction. It is entirely immanent within thinking itself for Hegel. Now here's where it gets fun, because so here's the differences, right? But the fun thing, and this is kind of the point of the talk, and Hegel sort of points this out in the Phenomenology, that all representational forms of thinking are conceptual, as well as dealing with objects, or as well as being representational, right? So all claims to knowledge that we have, all forms of representational thinking necessarily involve objects, or they involve objects, but they also necessarily involve concepts and conceptual thinking, right? How can I know that the apples that my friend bought are red if I don't have a concept of redness, or apple, or all, or fridge, or friend, and so on and so on? So conceptual schema and concepts are already baked into representational forms of knowledge for Hegel. So you can't have one without the other. Or sorry, you can't have representational thought without conceptual thinking. But you can have, and this is what Hegel shows in the Logic, you can have logical conceptual thought without any representation, right? And how and why that is the case. So this is Hegel's entire project in the Phenomenology, is to show how that process is possible. And then how that works in the Logic is what he shows in the Science of Logic. So they're big questions, but I mean, I think that would be the essential point there. that that Hegel is aware of these nuances, of these kind of minor distinctions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for lection. I have a question about nature of the subject. Hegel, in his system, based his philosophy on many other philosophers, includes Descartes and Hume. In Cartesian philosophy, subject is a rational cogito through radical doubt, his method, cognition and knowing of the world going through only rational and mental way. Contrary, in empirical subject, in philosophy of empiricism, David Hume's ideas, subject is more empirical entity, or its cognition is knowing of the world going through empirical way. There is two contrary positions, and my question is there a real entity as a subject itself, or subject is as an effect of this place of distinction of two or many subjects of rationalism, cogito, etc., and subject of empiricism, of perception, or mayhaps it will be material for next lecture, post-Hegelian subject of the practice in Marxist philosophy.
Yes, thank you. Well, as you can imagine, this is a very big question, and I mean, I would just say that that concept of subjectivity that Hegel well makes use of, but also uses, is not only, say, Descartes' notion. So yes, he's aware of Descartes, of course, and he comments on Descartes, and that is partly what he means by subjectivity, namely that which grounds its own self in its thinking, right? But Hegel also complicates the picture, because he also says, you may know that in the, he says in the Phenomenology, in the preface, that if philosophy's business is to know the truth and have the truth and so on, it needs to recognize that the absolute truth is not simply subjective or merely something that the subject can grasp, but it is at the same time, he says, equally substance. It is equally that which is opposed to the subject. Now, in terms of Descartes and Hume, well, I mean, of course, Hegel read both of them seriously, and he wrote about them seriously. But what he's really saying in his statement of subject and substance being taken together, and we will discuss this more next week, is that it's not enough to just simply rely on a notion of the subject as an isolated concept. And the reason he thinks this is because if you do that, you're again stuck within the framework of what he calls the understanding. You're assuming that that which is the subject is a human, finite, rational subject. This is what Descartes does in some sense, this is what Hume does, and this is what Kant does as well. Kant just assumes Kant's entire project in the First Critique is to kind of show the transcendental conditions necessary for experience to be possible for any finite rational being. And Hegel's entire, one of his big criticisms to European philosophy is why are we assuming that subjects are finite? Why aren't they infinite? Spinoza thought, you know, that subjects were infinite, that humans were infinite, or rather participated in something like the infinite. Why isn't Spinoza true? Why do we assume Kant or a Cartesian mode of thinking of subjectivity is the one that is the true mode of subjectivity? If you're Spinoza, you don't need to get beyond the subject, because everything is beyond the subject anyway for Spinoza. Everything is in the absolute substance, right? So, so Hegel's kind of point is that, well, fine, but we need to think about the relation between the subject and an object, not in an isolated manner, but in a way that accounts for both of them in their difference as a unity, as an identical unity in some sense. So, I mean, I can't say too much more about it because it is a very difficult aspect of Hegel's philosophy. Like I said, he and this is what Zizek argues, you know, Zizek thinks that what Hegel is really saying here is that what he calls subjectivity is a disparity within substance itself. It's a lack, it's a crack, it's a void, it's an incomplete part of substance, and this is what Hegel calls subjectivity. And so Zizek thinks you can read Hegel in that way, which is kind of it's an interesting way of reading Hegel. I had one more point, and I'm going to stop. But it was also just to say that well, it was just to kind of conclude on the idea that you know, the notion of the subject in Hegel is complex. It's not, because remember, even in the Phenomenology, Hegel uses the term consciousness and cognition and subject, but he never says human being, right? So you can read the first two chapters of the Phenomenology as applying to non-human forms of consciousness, like dolphins and dogs and crows and so on. And people have done this. People have written papers from a Hegelian point of view, applying his use of the term consciousness and knowledge to non-human animals. And of course, it's kind of, eventually human consciousness becomes the main thing for Hegel, because human beings are self-conscious. Not all forms of consciousness are self-conscious, according to Hegel. And I'll just end by saying that, of course, much work has been done on the nature of the self and subjectivity after Hegel. Of course, not only do we have Nietzsche and Freud, but we also have a lot of other kind of post-war French thinkers that complicate this problem. But that, you know, they try to show that you know, Foucault, for example, but not only Foucault, in some ways Deleuze does this, that the self, or you know, this enlightenment notion of the stable subject is not entirely the complete picture. You know, there are many selves. The self changes, mutates itself. It's reorienting. There's regions of the self that are unconscious and alien to the self. This is Freud, right? Freud's unconscious is that part of you that is not you in some sense. So the picture of subjectivity gets complicated, but that's fine. Complexity is needed, I think. Okay, I'll stop here. I hope that made sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
If anyone else has questions, feel free to ask. We do have some comments in the chats, I think, so maybe I can.
Yes, I asked a question in chat about possible parallelism in Hegel's and Luhmann's treatment of the problem of inside-outside distinction. Luhmann's system theory of society, it seems very, very interesting and perspective.
Forgive me, I'm not familiar with Luhmann's work all that much. Yes, okay, you're speaking about Nicholas Luhmann. I know a little bit. I'm not that familiar with his work, unfortunately. So I'm not really sure what he means or what you mean by his problem of inside, outside demarcations of a system. I'm not sure I would be much use. But you ask if there's a parallelism between Hegel and Luhmann. There could be, but like I said, I'm not I haven't read enough Luhmann to be able to answer that question adequately, unfortunately. Maybe if you want, you can send me a message or email or something. Maybe we can discuss it there. But does anyone else have a question, or should I just go through the chats?
If you like, I can add something here, Borna.
Sure. Yes, please.
To compare Luhmann with Hegel requires a stable understanding of what Luhmann is up to, and there are Luhmann is appropriating the work of Maturana and Varela in autopoiesis and cognition, and in particular in the mathematics of what's called boundary conditions, in particular in terms of the laws of form. And there have been a number of complaints with Luhmann's appropriation of that. So in order to create a parallelism between Hegel and Luhmann, we have to come to some kind of a stable understanding of what Luhmann is up to and where he's coming from. But the question of boundary conditions, I think if we just use that as a generic term rather than a specific one, becomes a really important one, because we're talking about the relationship between subject and object and the permeability in the frame around the subject and around the object. And that's why I wanted to bring this back to you. I'm not a philosopher and I don't play one on TV, as I like to say. But I've always responded to Hegel as someone who's basically constructing a narrative by which the self comes to understand itself through the other, through the object. And that one could conceivably, if not tongue-in-cheek, consider Hegel's philosophy as a narrative about the subject colonizing the object for its own purposes. So this brings in the question of power relationships and the differences in the construction of the subject as it begins that process of colonization. We're familiar with Plato, for example, and looking at desire through three different manifolds, to use Kant's word. And then we have Kant's own distinction between the sensory life and the imagination, the critical life in judgment, and the intuitive life in reason. And that the relationship between the subject and object is determined by which part of the manifold dominates in the process of cognition. So where do you see Kant one-upping, Hegel one-upping Kant on his model of the relationship between the subject cognizing the object?
Right.
In other words, we're talking about boundary conditions, and it's hard not to think about boundary conditions in terms of flight or fight or time to eat versus power relationships versus the desire for knowledge. So in terms of your establishing the boundary conditions here, where does Hegel improve on Kant in this establishment of boundary conditions? And here I'm using the word boundary conditions in a much more generic way than Luhmann and Maturana and Varela use it.
Yes. Sorry, excuse me. My phone is running out of batteries, and I'm trying to make sure that I can stay on. But I might cut out in a second, and then I'll come back. Yes, well, I would say, you know, how does Hegel one up Kant in this respect? Yes, I mean, in some ways for Kant, the subject does colonize and take over the object in a certain respect. But I think that would be Hegel's criticism or problem with Kant, that it's entirely one-sided. Kant can't understand how and in what ways the object penetrates and, in a sense, influences and affects and takes over consciousness or the subject in a certain respect. So for Hegel, I would say it's a reciprocal relationship. You know, I alluded to this earlier when I said for Hegel, he thinks that, you know, the object is outside and external to consciousness, and then we have a knowledge about it. That knowledge is internal to consciousness. So in some sense, the object penetrates the subject through our creation of an idea or a concept of it or a knowledge of it. And I mean, Hegel has no problem with this. He thinks this is how experience works. And of course, a lot of other thinkers prior to Kant and Hegel have, in a sense, pointed this out, but Hegel really wants to exploit this reciprocal mutual relation. He thinks the street goes both ways, as it were. And so he thinks that unless philosophy can really appreciate the bizarre and bewildering and contradictory account of this relationship between the object and the subject and the back and forth, what he calls the dialectical movement, unless philosophy can figure this out, it's not going to get anywhere, because you will remain one-sided, like in Kant, where it is just the subject overtaking the object. And in some sense, Hegel would say, well, Kant doesn't realize how the other, how the power relation works both ways in a certain respect. That would be, I think, his position, if I can summarize it. And I mean, how this relates to Luhmann, I mean, I'm not going to attempt to answer that, because but it is an interesting question about Luhmann's systems theory. There might be some parallels, I don't know. Thank you for your question.
I really enjoyed the presentation very much.
Great, thank you. So, well, if anyone else has any questions, please ask them on the mic, or what I could do is I could go through the chats quickly, and then I'm going to maybe wrap up in a bit, if that's okay. Because I think there were some other, I'm on my phone, as you probably know, which is accessing the chats. I have to poke at the screen. So I'm just scrolling up. So there's a Luhmann question. Okay, someone asked about, so someone asked, is it possible to think the object inside outside in Hegel, like a Mobius strip or a band or a loop? Yes, and I think actually this is what Zizek, through his Lacanian reading of Hegel, does in a certain respect. He's reading the Hegelian subject-object or subject-substance relationship as a sort of inverted Mobius strip. So Zizek does that, and I think it's interesting. I don't really agree with all of it entirely, but it's a creative way of thinking about it, I think. Yes, so like Lacan psychoanalysis. Okay, someone asked about milieu. They said they agree with my criticism of milieu. So we're trapped within our finitude. They're always, so I'm just reading the question out loud here. Sure. So idealism is always having an idea of it as outside. Well, I mean, idealism is always having an idea of something outside. Perhaps, at least that's one part of it. But I think Hegel would say that, and this is what I tried to show in the presentation, that ideal concepts or ideal ideal or idealized universals, as he calls them, concepts, are used in philosophies to apprehend or comprehend or account for the outside or whatever it is we're speaking about when we mean the outside. So it's not entirely having an idea of something outside, but that it's also outside and inside the subject, right? It's both at once. It's neither one nor the other, which is ultimately what Hegel wants us to realize. So I'm just scrolling through here. Okay, so Conrad points out that Malm strawmans hybridists like Moore, not by acknowledging that they see notions of subjectivity as real abstractions and thus as a basis for praxis. Yes, I mean, that might be true. Malm might and probably does strawman Jason Moore. I do also appreciate Jason Moore's work. But I think the key here is the notion of praxis or practice, which I'm going to talk about next week in more detail on how the notion of practice comes to intervene in this debate between subjectivity and objectivity through Marx and Hegel. So someone asked, what would the Hegelian interpretation of quantum physics be? That is something I do not know, but what I do know is, because I'm not a quantum physicist, and I don't really know the literature all that well, but what I do know is, again, Zizek has written a lot about this, where he tries to argue that, the Hegelian position has some sort of homology with quantum physics. I mean, if you mean the problem of the observable or the problem of the observer in quantum physics, then that's broadly aligned with something sort of that Hegel has been talking about how the subject and object both change together through formation of knowledge, through experience. I'll just leave that there. Okay, so I think that was all the chat questions. If there are any more questions that people may have, we can deal with them now. And then if we don't, we can wrap up and end it here. No, I think we're good.
Borna,
oh, sorry.
That's okay. This might be a really too big of a question for the end of the session, but I wanted to get a little bit clearer on Hegel's account of skepticism and how it's differing from earlier accounts like we might find in empiricism. And it seems like the way that you presented it, skepticism for Hegel is consciousness, but perhaps also could be a moment in this sort of speculative process, this sort of dialectical moment. And so I was wondering if you just sort of clarify a little bit how skepticism works in Hegel, or if that's too big a question, we could talk about it later.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, it is a bit of a big question, but I can maybe just point to it very quickly, I think, because when Hegel was young, he wrote this essay that no one reads anymore, but it's published in this edition called From Kant to Hegel, and it has essays by a lot of the German idealists. In that essay, he talks about skepticism, and this is before he writes the Phenomenology. And there he's thinking through himself about how, about what he likes about the Greek skeptics and what he doesn't like about the monoskeptics, and what he appreciates about Hume, but he has issues with Hume and Locke and so on. But there he argues for something like a speculative skepticism, if you want, or a very radical form of skepticism. And by this, and this is something that I said in the presentation a little bit, this is kind of part and parcel of his dialectical philosophy, right? So this whole business about philosophy can't have any presuppositions, or if we want knowledge of the truth, we can't assume that cognition is an instrument because you're assuming that it is an instrument, right? All of this stuff is this sort of skepticism that Hegel is trying to use or employ, because he doesn't want to take anything for granted. He thinks the entire history of Western metaphysics has gone astray because it's assumed a methodology, right? Either through, either by assigning first principles to things, either doing fundamental metaphysics and having a first principle that then founds or grounds the entire science, or Descartes, it's the radical doubt, right? Or like Spinoza, philosophers have assumed a method that they have borrowed from other fields, like mathematics, a geometric Euclidean method. And whether or not that is true of Spinoza is a different question, but at least to Hegel's mind, he thinks, well, look, if we're doing philosophy, and if philosophy's job is to grasp that which is absolutely true, that is, it's truth that's not relative to anything else, we can't make any assumptions about our method. Because if we assume a method, you're assuming the method is the way you get at the truth, right? But if we do that, and as he points out, and I pointed this out in the presentation, if we make that assumption while doing philosophy, we obscure and confound that which we're trying to seek, right? So the way to actually get at the truth for Hegel is to be a crazy skeptic. Don't assume anything. Don't assume what subjects mean. Don't assume what objects mean. And the phenomenology, eventually in the phenomenology, what he says in the end of the introduction is, look, the way to get at a cognition of the truth is just for philosophy to just do nothing and observe natural consciousness, just kind of have experiences, right? And so his kind of solution to this is to say, rather than make a list of definitions or axioms and so on, let's just watch and see what happens when natural consciousness has an experience. How does natural consciousness itself, what does natural consciousness itself think is true, right? And then what do we as philosophers think about what natural consciousness thinks, right? And this is what he does in phenomenology. So he's applying this kind of skepticism, right? And he applies it again to logic. He says, if we're doing a system of logic or a system of science, we can't be Spinozists, we can't be Descartes, we can't be any of the other thinkers. We can't assume that our philosophy has to have a form that's already made for it. It has to be self-grounding and self-determining. And in some sense, what he says, philosophy needs to be, if it's to be a science, it has to be presuppositionless. It cannot make any assumptions. Now, whether or not Hegel is successful in this is a contentious debate. People are still arguing about it because in some sense there are presuppositions, or in some sense Hegel tries to show that logical thinking or scientific philosophical thinking eventually becomes its own presupposition, but in a retrospective dialectical sense. So you don't assume anything, and this is what he says in the Logic. We're not going to assume a method, but he says, I'm only going to reveal to you what the method is in the last chapter of the book. And this is what he does, both in the phenomenology and in the science of logic, right? So it's a confounding, bewildering experience, but he wants to apply that skepticism that you asked about. And it is, and as I tried to show today, it is more radical than Hume, because as he complains about Hume, Hume isn't a skeptic enough. Hume just assumes that experiences are given to us and we can form knowledge about this. Hume doesn't really question, he's not skeptical of the nature of subjectivity, really. He doesn't really care. Deleuze has things to say about this, of course, but that's a different conversation. so this is kind of Hegel's point, is that philosophy ought to be ruthless skeptics, but so ruthless that you can't even take anything for granted, including the way we go about forming knowledge, right? So he wants to shave all of this back. He wants to get at the core of the matter, as it were, and discard all of this philosophical historical baggage. Because again, he's serious about cognizing the truth. So that would be my answer. But it's interesting. Not many people have written about Hegel skepticism. It's not something that really. It's not really. At least I haven't seen it become a very popular theme. But I think it's very, it's the core of his conceptual and historical thought, and including what he does in the phenomenology. So that's what I would say. So thank you for that. So someone asked about Heidegger's Dasein. I don't have enough time to go into Heidegger's Dasein here, unfortunately. That's a very complicated and different discussion, unfortunately. But it's a good question. And someone had to ask whether where I disagree with Zizek. Well, I admire his work very much, and I'll just say that and Zizek is still working on this, so he might prove me wrong at some point. But his whole Lacanian reading of Hegel, which is difficult, he still hasn't really been able to piece the entire thing together, and he is aware of it. So his last book, the one that came out last September, on Sex and the Failed Absolute, is Zizek's attempt to kind of really reframe his entire philosophical corpus. It's a really good book. I highly recommend that book of Zizek's, Sex and the Failed Absolute, because there he's much more clear about what it is he's doing. But because his project isn't finished, basically my issue is, okay, great, Hegel and Lacan, but can you adequately give a consistent reading of Hegel through Lacan, right? And in some ways, Zizek has been working on this since his French PhD thesis on Hegel and Lacan, since the beginning. So I know that he appreciates the problem that he's working on. And I hope that he will eventually get to a point where he can give a more consistent overview of his project, because he's been, ever since he published Hegel in the Shadow of the Absolute, or Dialectical Materialism, the Less Than Nothing book, the big book. Ever since he published Less Than Nothing, he's been reframing and recasting this project for himself in a very serious way. And while I think the inclusion of Lacan into Hegel is interesting and productive, and I like it, I do have some questions about how Zizek then reads the absolute. Because of course, the absolute is not, so if Zizek thinks Hegel's absolute is absolute, but it's not complete, that in fact for Zizek, the absolute is incomplete. My question for him is, at what level is this incompleteness? Is it simply an ontological claim, or is it historical, or is it a relation between the two? Because that's not really clear in Zizek. It's not clear in Hegel either, right? What is the relation between the absolute and history? But I would say that's my kind of question, is that if you read Hegel, or if you read Hegel through a Lacanian lens, and you read Hegel as a barred, Hegel's notion of the subject as a barred subject, the way Zizek does, Zizek wants to read Hegel as, in a sense, as kind of, he wants to read Hegel's absolute as not being a complete product. Let me just put it that way. And so the question is, well, in what sense is that the absolute then, if it's not a complete absolute? Can we call it the absolute? He calls it the failed absolute in some sense, but But is Zizek removing or discrediting or dismissing the notion of an absolute in Hegel? I don't think he really is, but I mean that would be a question I have with him. All right, I think so. I think that's all, if I can say so. Thank you all very much for listening. I thank you for your patience. It's been about an hour and a half. I hope it was enjoyable and not too boring. And just, I mean, I'm sure Sipit is going to say something, but just before I just log off, there's going to be another session at the exact same time next week, next Saturday, and we're going to just continue the discussion from Hegel onto Marx and materialism and the notion of subjectivity and the role that practice plays in all of this. So that's the other side of this kind of lecture series. I hope to see all of you there, but these things are being recorded. So perhaps if you ask for an object, if they have a recording, they could send it to you if you can't make it next week. All right, that's it for me. Thank you.